huge economic opportunity that has been exploited by organized crime groups and has contributed to all the corruption, violence, and everything that happened under alcohol prohibition. Another thing that I paused to say this morning, and I'll take this moment to do it again tonight. One challenge with Stop Gun Violence BC is that we've tried to shift the discussion where people were pointing out the hypocrisy of marijuana being illegal when it is less dangerous than alcohol, etc. And we've tried to shift the discussion to talk more about the harms and unintended consequences of prohibition. And I think Dana did a great job describing them. But it's also important to note that not everybody involved in the marijuana industry is violent, and obviously the vast majority of people aren't. But working in an urban hospital in downtown Vancouver, and on several occasions have had to be involved in the resuscitation of people who have been shot in gang violence, I can tell you that when the marijuana comes down to the Lower Mainland from all the other areas of the province, certainly organized crime has their talents deeply involved in it. Even when it's disorganized crime, and I'm starting to steal your language, David, but sometimes it is, disorganized things like this, but the home invasions, the property damage, the hydro theft, the grow-ops, all of this activity is really because of the illegality of marijuana. I always try to point out that this isn't really a left versus right issue, and I think evidence of that is the take that the Fraser Institute took back in 2004 with this report, where they estimated that the cannabis industry in BC was worth anywhere between $2 and $7 billion annually. And you can see what they concluded. If we treat it like any other commodity, we can tax it, regulate it, and use the resources that industry generates rather than continue a war against consumption and production that has long ago been lost. And that's from that's from one of Canada's most right-wing think tanks. Okay, so this isn't just leftward-leaning people. This is something that the Global Commission on Drug Policy released this summer, where they were looking at the effective funding for drug law enforcement and the effect of the availability of drugs. So I don't have a laser pointer, but I'll walk you through this. The histogram, the blue bars, is the funding, the federal funding in the United States under the war on drugs. So it excludes state funding, but that is an inflation-adjusted 340% increase in federal funding meant to reduce the availability of drugs. Then, by example, they looked at heroin, and if this was reducing the supply of heroin, the laws of supply and demand would hold that the price would go up, and theoretically, if less supply was getting into the country, that the purity would go down. But if you look at the US government's own data, the green line there shows that the purity of the price of heroin, has gone down dramatically. And that's not because heroin is less pure or less desirable, but actually the orange line is the purity of heroin. And you can see that the purity of heroin has gone up exponentially. So despite the best efforts of law enforcement, organized crime has totally overwhelmed efforts to control heroin in this case. Of course, it hasn't just been simply ineffective, it's just been a horrible social experiment, the war on drugs in the United States. It's estimated that about 1 in 8 African-American males between the ages of 25 and 35 is incarcerated on any given day in the United States. So the impact on inner city communities of locking up just hundreds of thousands of people for nonviolent drug offenses has had huge effects on those communities. We're here tonight to talk about marijuana, so I'll just quickly make the point that, of course, if you look at marijuana, the blue line there is the estimated price of marijuana in the United States. You can see how it's gone down. And of course, as everybody knows, the potency of marijuana, that's the red line, in recent years has also gone up dramatically. No comment. The National Institutes on Drug Abuse is the sort of the arm of the U.S. government charged with looking at what the effects of drugs and drug policies are in the United States. So it's under that sort of conservative umbrella that is operating under the war on drugs, but they fund a lot of research, including my own, and you can see what they concluded about the impacts of marijuana prohibition. Over the last 30 years of cannabis prohibition, the drug has remained almost universally available to American 12th graders, with approximately 80 to 90% saying that the drug is easy to obtain. So you know, the U.S. government's own data just showing how ineffective this policy has been. I've alluded to unintended consequences, but I do try where possible to sort of speak from an evidence-based perspective, and this is a paper that I'll just talk a little bit because it's really galvanized my thinking in terms of sort of the genesis of Stop the Violence BC. In medicine, we sort of have an evidence-based pyramid where there's a hierarchy of evidence, and at the top of that pyramid is the systematic review. So this is a paper conducted by a guy named Dan Word, who's a PhD candidate in my lab. Greg Rowe is the head of the Woodward Library at UBC, so the head of the medicine library. And Gordon Guyatt is an epidemiologist from McMaster who coined the phrase evidence-based medicine and has contributed a lot academically to how to do these types of systematic reviews. So to make a long story short, this study looked at every English language study that had ever looked at the effect of increasing drug law enforcement on violence. And it found that there's no English language study that has ever shown that increasing drug law enforcement reduces violence. And there's a huge literature describing how when you put money into taking drug dealers off of corners, that creates a vacuum, that creates an economic opportunity that leads to more bloodshed. So we know that increasing drug law enforcement does increase violence. That led to a group of people, including David Bratz and myself and others, came together to start this organization called Stop the Violence BC. This was our first report when we launched in October last year called Breaking the Silence, trying to get a dialogue started on this issue. We're a coalition of experts, and essentially we have three basic objectives. We're trying to educate the population at large about just the failure of supply reduction and how essentially for young people they now have easier access to marijuana than alcohol and tobacco, and that's just a pillar of the conversation that I think we need to keep in the forefront of the discussion. We're also talking about the harms of the existing model and really trying to reinforce the concept in sort of a public mindset that when you hear about a grow-op, you hear about a home invasion of a hydro theft or a gang violence related to the drug industry, that's all an expected and natural consequence of marijuana prohibition. And it's not something that more prohibition can actually turn around. And the last thing is latching on to this discussion that has really emerged from British Columbia through the Health Officers Council of BC, that all psychoactive substances, there are tools to regulate them. And there's a vast science for how we can regulate alcohol better. Tobacco is we've learned a lot about regulation from, and we should be employing that to marijuana to actually improve public health and safety by waging economic war on organized crime, but also a public health approach that can achieve public health goals. You're not meant to be able to read that, but it's supposed to convey to you the sort of types of individuals that are involved with Stop the Violence BC. So, former Supreme Court justices, current police officers, former police officers, 4 former attorneys general from BC, a range of health experts from all major universities in BC. I could go on, but it's a very strong group. This is something from the Health Officers Council of BC that we've incorporated into our work, and that's looking at the harms of pretty much any drug, but you can insert marijuana here, and that when social problems go up with prohibition, but also if we took an approach where we thought, well, cannabis is there's no harms from it, and let's advertise it, let's promote it, let's not take a public health approach, then that could lead to increased social problems as well. But there's probably a sweet spot in the middle there, and the evidence strongly suggests that there is, that through strict regulation, we can have the best outcome in terms of public health and safety. It's largely been, there's been very, very little media that hasn't been supportive when people have been sticking their necks out on this issue. So that was the editorial from the province when the former mayors Door Stop the Violence BC. Business in Vancouver is sort of like your downtown Vancouver. Readership is really obviously following that. This is what Peter Ladner had to say in Business in Vancouver. The Vancouver Sun has written a number of supportive editorials. This is when the Health Officers Council of BC endorsed Stop the Violence BC. That was the editorial from the Globe and Mail and the former Attorney Generals. So I could actually share additional examples. I think I preached to the converted given the applause earlier, but there are people, and certainly there was in the room today, that were really scratching their heads when, you know, I'm convinced that this doesn't work. And I think earlier, I guess that was last week on a conference call, Jeff Plant, the former Attorney General, said that, you know, an idiot in a hurry can conclude that cannabis prohibition doesn't work. Unfortunately, he didn't say that today, but there's people in the room sort of scratching their heads. You know, there's the people that were arguing for the status quo, and then there was some of us that were there on a volunteer basis, and a huge issue is conflict of interest. And this is the Auditor General said several years ago, audited Canada's drug strategy and concluded that about 94% of the funding that goes into Canada's drug strategy goes to law enforcement. And then it concluded of particular concern is the almost complete absence of basic management information on spending, resources, on expectations, on or results of an activity that accounts for almost $500 million each year. So that's federal dollars. That's not accounting for, you know, what municipalities and provinces are spending with their police budgets, with their anti-grow teams, and, you know, all the enforcement expenses that are placed elsewhere. But we're talking about almost all federal dollars, and it's probably true on a provincial basis going to law enforcement, and that creates a huge conflict of interest. It's worth talking a little bit about public opinion, and we did some polling through Angus Reid before we launched Stop the Violence BC, and I'd be quite curious to see where the polling is actually potentially shifted, given how there's been a lot of conversation in the media about marijuana recently. So about 12% of British Columbians support keeping the existing marijuana laws unchanged. You could scratch your head a little bit and think, well, maybe some people would like to see them made more strict, but actually you can see that almost 80% think that possession of marijuana, at least as this question was asked, should not lead to a criminal record. I mean, you know, there's so few things that 80% of British Columbians can agree on. You know, the politicians are so far behind the public on this, it's just remarkable. Chasing and arresting marijuana producers and sellers is ineffective. We would be better off taxing and regulating the adult use of marijuana. You can see that almost 70% of people agree with that. So obviously data has said some ways that people can get involved, and I certainly encourage them to do so. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much for